Hey folks, welcome back to Gaming Garbage, where we take a look at games, chat about the gaming news in the industry, and of course stream for fun. Today we're going to be taking a look at part 2 of PlayStation versus Xbox. This is a state of gaming. Now what state of gaming is just taking a look at the overall gaming industry, or maybe a certain sector of it, and kind of digging in a little deeper. And for people that commented on my last PlayStation versus Xbox, I had one comment in particular that wasn't particularly keen about the console war and didn't care and whatever. And it's not my job or my proposition to pick one of these companies. It's really to see who's going to have the most influence over the next decade or two, because I really think that is going to shape the gaming industry. If we have Xbox versus PlayStation, or let's say Nintendo or PC, if one of them has a bigger foothold on the industry, it's going to change how the rest of the industry goes. And that's why I think this is important to talk about. So thanks for tuning in, folks. If you haven't seen part 1, please go ahead and take a look at that. I'll try to link that at the beginning or the end of this video. There's also a ton of data still to go through. This is also at 3 in the morning, so please forgive any mishaps or anything like that, but I do really care about the gaming industry and talking about some of this stuff, so let's go ahead and get into it. So first we're going to go over PlayStation 2 versus Miles Morales. These were two games that roughly came out around the same time, and they had two very different budgets. They had two very different sets of assets, and Sony got to talking about them. And we got to learn about all this through the Insomniac Hack. There was a lot of data to go through. What I won't be sharing in the Insomniac Hack is like upcoming games, personal information. This is just company focused. After that, we're going to go over sales data. And then I'm going to be sharing my final thoughts for this particular part 2. And probably just overall, this will be the last one. So with the Insomniac Hack, Sony had a lot of documents that were released and hacked out of like game budgets, sales data, all sorts of things. And when we started digging into stuff, something that was pretty prominent to see was Spider-Man 2 and Miles Morales. Now these were two different games, and I got this data from Kotaku, who dug pretty good into it, and also Bellular News. If you're interested in kind of more deep dives or kind of more specific dives, Bellular News is actually a really great YouTube channel. I suggest you work on checking them out. They're roughly at about probably 300,000 or 400,000 subscribers right now. And yeah, they're doing a good job. But so taking a look at Spider-Man 2, and at a budget of $270 million, this does not include marketing. And by the end of it all, it cost them like $312 million. So they went like $42 million over budget. To break even, they would need to sell a total of 7.2 million copies, which is crazy. This is equal to about $500 million. And this would actually include the budget, plus the licensing, plus the marketing, and everything else. This is taking everything into account. The dev time for this game was 5 years, and they also had help from Marvel. So what Marvel was offering was $120 million per title, plus $9 million up front in advance. And the deal is that Marvel would get royalties of about 9 to 26%, depending on sales and depending on what type of sale it was, like whether it was physical or digital. Plus, there was an additional $30 million in marketing. Well, maybe this was just, included with the $120 million. But still, $120 million is a ton of money. So this wasn't just Sony's budget and marketing. This was also Marvel's on top of it. So the total figures for this is not exactly perfectly clear, but I mean, this game was crazy expensive to make, and to even make their money back, and whatever they would make back as a profit, well, a good chunk of that would go to royalties for Marvel. And so Sony knew that. And that's something too that can hurt a company. If a game maybe does really well, but like the initial cost is high, it can be pretty brutal once you still have to start paying out third-party royalties, and that can get pretty expensive. So as of November 12th, again, this data is fairly old. I've been working on PlayStation versus Xbox since January, and it's finally getting finished in March, thank goodness. But as of November 12th, they've sold a little over 6 million copies. And still, so they're kind of within striking distance, with the holidays coming up with Thanksgiving and Black Friday and Christmas and New Year's. They're within striking a distance, and they probably hit that. But still, like, they won't make a really good profit margin with Spider-Man 2. And even though some of the other IPs and some of the different non-live service, non-battle royale games, they do make money, they do a good job, but it's not as much money as the companies are wanting. And if you're a company, you're going to be like, well, I want to make the best product or the most service that I can, but also what's more important is making more revenue. And so a great way to kind of look at this is Diablo 4. Like, Diablo Immortal was a mobile game, wouldn't take as much time to develop and money to develop, but it still made a really good chunk of money. It made like over 500 million here in like the first 7 or 8 months of being released. Even like Monopoly Go is a simple mobile game, and that made over $1 billion within its first year. So like, people spend money on these games, and the companies know it. I mean, the data's there, and so they want to get their biggest bang for their buck for the amount of time and the amount of initial investment that they have. And yeah, they're, again, Spider-Man 2 definitely made profit, and it will continue to make profit, but it's not as big of a moneymaker as they were hoping for. And this is when we're going to start getting into a budget presentation that Sony had that was leaked, is that, now they're going to be having AAA games that will have a budget of a max of $350 million. When you work on adjusting for inflation, that's about $215 million. And so that's just not as much money. You're taking roughly about a third of the buying power out of what Spider-Man 2 had for an initial budget, and replacing it with just less money. And so these games going forward are probably going to be smaller, and they might still have some quality control issues, but they're also going to have less dev time, I would hope, because again, their budget isn't as big. And so games like Spider-Man 2, they're wonderful games. They score really high. They do a great job, but they're going to have a smaller budget moving forward, at least with Sony. They've realized that they need to make their games on a smaller scale, because $500 million to break even is too much money. It's too much of a risk. And we've honestly had some fairly big games like Suicide Squad or like Skull and Bones recently, where they're seen as horrible failures, and when you spend hundreds of millions on a video game and take all of that time to build it, and it doesn't go well, it's a big loss for the company. Warner Brothers worked on stating that with the CFO, explaining that Suicide Squad was gonna, with how Suicide Squad did, it was gonna make basically a failure in the gaming industry for Warner Brothers, and it wasn't gonna make their overall stuff look good by the end of the year, and they know that. Let's see. So looking at Miles Morales, this was a different game, and the reason Sony figured out in their, with their budget presentation for 2023 of why they're going to make their budget smaller for AAA games is because of Miles Morales. Now, this was a smaller game, of course. This had a budget of $90 million. They also used old assets from stuff they had already made and worked them together, and they worked them together really well. It wasn't without its bugs, but the devs didn't have to spend time making fresh assets to put in games. They maybe did that a little bit, but things were kind of more of like drop in, drop out to create their game, and they could kind of skip that step in development. This also, thanks to that, this took 2 years less in development. They were able to push this game out with a budget of around $100 million. And then they sold over 10 million copies. It sold more than Spider-Man 2 did at the time. And this was also a cheaper price point. This was $50. This wasn't $70. And, when you have a cheaper price, you're going to encourage more people to buy. You're going to open up your possible, market, because it's cheaper for everybody. Which is great. And so, selling over 10 million copies for a game that cost them $100 million with 2 years less in development, that looks really good compared to Spider-Man 2. And they know it. And again, it's all about that efficiency of time and how much money you can draw in. That's why these live service games are so popular. I'm not saying Spider-Man 2 is a live service. I'm just saying live service in general today. That's why so many companies have gone that way, including Suicide Squad and including Skull and Bones. But honestly, we're tired of it. And you can make live service a good game like Helldivers 2. But again, it's like a $50 price point or a $40 price point. And the focus of the game is to have fun and the squad experience. And then, monetization is more of an afterthought or an addition to the game. Man, these companies need to figure that out. They really do. And so what we can see with this is that this was a cheaper game that was more affordable for more people. And also at the time, inflation was pretty high still. And so, yeah, you got to spend less on things you don't need, on luxurious goods like video games. And smaller games are starting to become more popular. So we've also seen Assassin's Creed Mirage. We've also seen more remasters and remakes. And again, these are all kind of smaller scale studios. And so A and AA studios are honestly making more money. And the companies are starting to see this. They're starting to have better kind of like, positive net growth or net sales or net revenue, however you want to look at it. But on the margin, these AA studios, they're making a lot more money than these AAAs. And maybe the AAAs have a lot more revenue coming through, but they're just not making as much because the expenses are so high. And so this is a lesson for all publishers and all studios, is that the quality has to be good. Because examples like Suicide Squad and Skull and Bones shows that these games are already dead. And there's still going to be a few people that are going to play these games. And hey, if you like them too, that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But for the general majority, these games are not going to be making their money back. Skull and Bones doesn't even have 1 million players. And we don't have Steam charts for Skull and Bones. But when we take a look at, Play Tracker or PlayStation Game Tracker, anyway, it's something like that. They just track PlayStation games. But, the popularity of Skull and Bones on PlayStation is a 1. It's not doing very good, and the average people that have played is about 27 hours, and after that they're done. There's just not much more. But these other Assassin's Creed games that we had, which is what this is modeled after, people played a lot more than that. And these games, in some of them, like Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla, simply by scope, were more hours than 27 hours. In games like Suicide Squad, we already see the counts are basically under 1,000. They're under 400 now for a peak, which is wild. Like, Suicide Squad is a done deal. For those of you that bought it, I'm sorry. This is also a lesson for Xbox. And so, even though some of these AA games or smaller studios might be making more money, it's also a better way for them to get them on their gaming service, Game Pass. And see, instead of making really good games, Xbox is focused on creating a platform for games like Miles Morales to be able to come onto the platform from anybody, inside or outside of Xbox. Xbox also, when you have all of these games coming within even a week or a month, it makes them cheaper because some of these you're going to be buying. Like we have Space Engineers now, which most of us have probably bought that, but pretty quickly soon after we had Dead Island 2. That's on the game service now. We also just got Warhammer Bolt Gun on there. We got Maneater, which I kind of want to showcase on the channel. I hope you guys vote for it with one of the random numbers someday. But like, they have a lot of good titles on there still, and some titles that have been on there for quite a long time too. Game Pass also has day one stuff. And even if the games aren't amazing, if they're kind of like mid or poor quality, it lessens the blow to the purchaser because there's hundreds of other games to play. And so this is how Xbox is being able to circumvent some of the AAA failures, because there's so many more other games to play with the service. And it's honestly, it's kind of like what Steam is and Epic Store. Like for PC, I mean, they allow more people to be able to buy more games or have more access to games at a cheaper price point. It's known that PC is probably the cheapest place to get your games. because PC players won't buy more expensive games like we will on console. They don't want to pay more than $40 or $50. That's pretty much their max. And if they don't like the game, it spreads really, really quick. Be like, hey, this game is garbage. Don't buy it. Buy something else. And so Sony understands that they need to produce more quality and they need to limit risk. Because what if Spider-Man 2 didn't get the sales numbers that they were hoping for? Again, even, by the release of this data in November, Spider-Man 2 hadn't made enough sales yet to even break even, which is crazy. Sony has also delayed, let's not forget, 6 out of their 12 live service games, including Marathon, and they've also delayed twice the final shape for Destiny 2, which is like the ending for the game. And so, yeah, seeing the difference between Spider-Man 2 and Miles Morales, it's like, the initial cost up front is kind of expensive, and the dev time and the assets, but being able to make some kind of cheaper games that sold quite a bit better in the same period of time is showing that there's better profit margins there, and that's going to make the company more sustainable. So next we're going to get into bulk data. Now, again, this is from the Insomniac Hack, but we're also getting stuff from Statista. We're also getting stuff from Bellular News and Kotaku. We're also getting things too from the Sony. What do they call that? It's like a Sony financial meeting, quarterly. Once every 3 months. So what you can see from the bulk sales data, and most of this is by February of 2022. I know this still is pretty old, but this is the only data that we have. But it does show some interesting stuff. Many of the exclusives are doing very, very well, making hundreds of millions of dollars for the company. Even in some cases, over 500,000, or 500 million, which is really good for revenue. And so these are games like God of War, Horizon, the Spider-Man games, Bloodborne even, and Ratchet and Clank. And so some of the exclusives that they have are doing very, very good. I'm sure Demon's Souls remake also did very well when they bought that. Also, the exclusives that they have ported over to PC, they're also doing very well. And so we've seen with the new CEO, they've talked about, making their games more multi-platform and expanding the audience. And again, if you're getting into PC, that's an extra billion players that could be buying your game. And if it's really good, like Helldivers 2, you can guarantee that there's millions that have been buying Helldivers 2 just on PC. I have no doubt in my mind. And so, yeah, Horizon did really well in 2021. God of War did really good in 2022. And Days Gone as well in 2021. And these games sold millions of copies just on PC, let alone the millions that they sold on PlayStation. And so PC ports have been a pretty good avenue for some of the games for PlayStation to do. And maybe even if a game does really well, they'll be like, yeah, we'll probably want to port that over to PC because of the sales. And folks, that's going to be the main focus, is that it's sales. This is what Sony and Microsoft are both figuring out about their future of their gaming sectors for the company, is like, look, it's about sales. It's about money flow coming in. And the more they can branch that out, the more they can make that available to more people, the more money's going to come. That's why we see services like Game Pass, and this is why we're seeing PlayStation port over more games for PC, and continuing to expand that too. Game Pass, again, is console and also has Ultimate, but they also have, a cloud gaming platform. They also have a mobile gaming platform. And then they're expanding into PC, which that's where they're seeing the most growth. Sony as well, they're wanting to continue to expand more games and more future titles into PC and make them available so that people can purchase them. What we're seeing too is that when we take a look at total revenue, this was one other point. Most of their exclusives that are sold, they're sold as physical copies, anywhere as low as 50% all the way up to 75% of sales, which is really impressive. So we've had some news too about Microsoft having layoffs with making their games physical, right? We've also seen too that a lot of companies, in most cases, have sold most of their games as digital copies, like Cyberpunk. Even though that made around $1 billion, Cyberpunk only had 6% of physical sales. So 93% were digital. And I think it's because, when the game sucks, people are willing to buy the game, but at a cheaper price point. And the easiest way to do that is digital. Just wait for the sale to show up, and sometimes the sales are very good. You can get it half off or whatever. I actually have one of the few 6% copies that's sold in the world. But yeah, even with games that Cyberpunk or they get fixed or whatever, a lot of them are still digital sales. And this is why these companies are switching more toward digital and less toward physical. It's simply because of the buying numbers. Now, they benefit from stuff too, but folks, if we didn't have the behaviors of buying mostly digital, then physical would still be a bigger focus than it is today. And so, in my opinion, it's really us to blame. If you want physical copies to stay around, keep buying them. So when we take a look at total revenues between the two, this is between Sony and between Microsoft. Sony has made $26 billion in gaming, while Xbox made about $16 billion in gaming. And this was in 2022. Now, looking at 2023 numbers, Sony has still made around 25, 26, 27 billion. But Microsoft made quite a bit more. They had a lot more growth, and that was because of Game Pass and also PC Game Pass. They had, I should have written this down. This was a new number just released last month. Well, what's interesting is they don't have gaming separate as a category. It's meshed in with cloud gaming, with like Intel, what they call Intel Cloud. But this also includes Copilot or ChatGTP. This also includes other services like through their Windows 365 and that kind of thing. And so there isn't really a separate data. But we know that last year Microsoft just made $9 billion on Game Pass, and that they're still expanding on Game Pass. They have 35 million users now, paying a minimum of $10 a month. So, do the math. That's a ton. And that's just on Game Pass. That's not sales for anything else. We know that, Microsoft is not making money on their hardware. We got to see that. Sony is. And the reason Sony is selling so many consoles is because of their exclusives. And for Sony, PlayStation is their biggest category out of the entire company. It's a third of the company. But with Xbox, it's a sliver compared to what Microsoft is making. It's really quite different. I know, like Intel Cloud, Microsoft made $88 billion last year. It's insane. Total revenues for last year for Sony was $89 billion, which is a ton of money. And Microsoft made $220 billion. 3 times as much. Well, no, 2.5. It'd be like 2.5 times, which is pretty wild. And so roughly Game Pass has been making about half of the gaming revenue right now. It's been making a ton. When we got to see some emails as well from Sony, from the corporate side, and they kind of feel leapfrogged by Microsoft. And that isn't just Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard. It's also the strategic value across live service games, scaling into mobile, and getting into PC. And so again, Game Pass, as we've said, is the biggest expansion into PC. And Microsoft is also building a mobile store to compete with Google and Apple. And Epic's win against Google, congratulations to them, is also going to benefit Microsoft, because it's going to open up the doorways for them a little better to be able to gain access into those markets. Because, again, we have like antitrust and anti-competitive laws that, try to keep competition around. and make it easier so that way we don't have monopolies. Because we know ultimately monopolies are horrible, which honestly Microsoft is simply becoming one. So Sony feels that its pillars that it has in gaming are kind of outdated, and that they're falling behind the competition as they haven't expanded. So again, they've had timed exclusives, which was good in the short run, but long term it hasn't really procured a lot of extra money. And now they're kind of shifting their focus a little bit to say, hey, we're going to bring more stuff to PC. Also, when Sony's taken a look at 2027, which is around the time of the next launch for next gen, which, boy, that will be wild, I think, they're noticing a content difference. And so there's timed and exclusive content, but Xbox is wanting to expand on more of that. They're still going to have exclusives. A lot of people went a little too far to say that basically everything that Xbox has was going to go to everybody, which no, that's not the case. But games that have kind of run their life cycle and they're kind of so far non-legendary IPs are going to be expanded into Switch to PC and to PlayStation. But yeah, but Sony is seeing that there's that some of their business on the content needs to change of when they release it and who. There's also more exclusives that will create more dominance, and so with Xbox having bought so much of different companies and different IPs, and we got to cover that in part 1. Don't forget to watch that, folks, if you haven't yet. So continuing on with 2027. PlayStation feels like their PlayStation Plus is threatened, and that they can actually, by 2027 and by the next gen, lose $1.5 billion in revenue. So the costs are going up, but something we got to see, which we covered again in part 1, is that they're not really expanding their subscribers. And we got a breakdown, which was really nice, of how many they have in each platform, but the bulk of their subscribers, basically 70% of them, are plugged into Essentials, which is just maintaining multiplayer. And they still have some into the others, but not as many. And the one that has the least amount is their Premium, which was like their entire, legacy in backwards compatibility list, along with other extras from like PlayStation 4 and stuff like that. Excuse me. And so, yeah, they're not seeing the sustainability there. And the issue that they have is they can't really change that too much because there's only so many legacy titles that they have that can entice people to buy. But again, how many times are you guys going to play those games? And another thing, too, is that they can't bring their good IPs like Spider-Man 2 or even Helldivers at this point to PlayStation Plus as part of the service to be a part of day one, like what Xbox is doing, because they would lose more revenue down the line than they would make by selling those games individually. Again, the bulk sales data that we had on some of these games like God of War and Horizon, well, they probably wouldn't make that much, and they would have to take a long hit for years at a time to actually entice people to start buying premium at a higher price point. And they would probably also raise the price too, because let's face it, $160 or $170 for premium is pretty cheap. But if you're trying to get some of that revenue back by selling these games individually, well, you're probably going to be more around Game Pass at $200 or $210 for a year. And so, yeah, PlayStation knows that PlayStation Plus is not really making them money. It's also not sustainable long term, and they need a way to fix that. Multi-game subscription services. Again, this is, what they're seeing with Game Pass is that they're on PC, they're on mobile, they have Game Pass for consoles. They're bringing new content literally every week, and the games that aren't being played, they're being fluffed off the service about once every couple of weeks or, once a month. There's kind of like a set of games that are leaving. Like Hard Space Shipbreaker is leaving this week. And so there's still an opportunity to play it. There's also an opportunity to buy it at a discount if you don't own it, which is a fun one, by the way. Look into that if you're interested. But some of these games are across multiple services and multiple platforms. And something, too, that we're starting to see is, maybe not a lot of people do this, but like with Helldivers 2, for example, is that there's cross-save between PlayStation and PC, which is really nice. But we're starting to see this broadening of access. Instead of exclusivity being the goal to entice people to the platform, to get them to the console so that they can buy more games, buy more accessories, and buy more services, we're now seeing that the focus is becoming the service that has games, that gets you to the console, that gets you to the accessories, that gets you to other gaming services. And that's the thing that they're starting to see. And that's what Microsoft has been doing. So if you want to think about it, Game Pass is more like an engine. And the exclusives, like with Activision Blizzard or the other IPs that they've bought in, like Bethesda or like, trying to think, or ZeniMax, is that, those companies, those dev studios, they're the fuel. And even though, they might lose money in a way, they're gaining so many people on Game Pass. 35 million now, just on Game Pass. That's insane. That's an insane amount of money. It's just going to continue to expand. And it's still a little murky on 35 million being on console or being on PC. We don't exactly know where the breakdown is. But hopefully we'll get more clarity about that as time goes on. But, remember, we only got roughly 25 million Series X's and Series S's out there. Now, there's still some Xbox One players that also have Game Pass. They can get the console edition, I believe. And Ultimate, I think, is just for the current gen. But yeah, I do think it's going to be interesting how this continues on for the next several years, for the next gens to come out for Sony and PlayStation. And instead of exclusives, I think services is going to be a bigger draw to Xbox. We're going to see. And so Sony knows that they can't have day one exclusives on PlayStation Plus, because they just won't make as much. So my overall takeaways, and what I like about some of this data that I'm going through today, is that it's by Sony's own admission. Again, this stuff was not meant to be public, but it is, and we can see that Sony even feels like they're getting behind, like their pillars are getting old, that they need to innovate and change something else. And Sony's success over the last several generations, like with PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4, and most of us probably too also had a PlayStation 2, Sony knows that consoles is not the end game. They know that. They just said too that their consoles are starting to stagnate. They're not going to be selling as much. So they're also going to not kind of cap out on how many exclusives they can sell. Because again, most of those are just a PlayStation. They're not available on PC or Xbox. And this is why the new CEO of PlayStation is saying, yeah, we're going to expand more stuff in the future to PC. Because it's about revenue growth, folks. And so Sony feels outmaneuvered in almost every aspect, besides their console sales and their exclusives. But again, their console sales are slowing down, and their exclusives can only sell so much if their console sales are slowing. But like game services, well, Game Pass has $1 billion, and it's making $900 billion back every year, and it's accelerating. There's also, Xbox has mobile now. They have King, which they're planning to make a mobile game store so that they can dig into the mobile market, which I am not a fan of, but hey, that's again where some of the money is. Also, PC access. There's over 1 billion players globally, and keeping exclusives just to PS5 is stupid. They already see that their potential down the road is slowing, so they need to expand into other stuff. And Xbox has already figured this out with Game Pass. It's like, hey, you can get we can get people on PC, and Game Pass is having the biggest growth with PC players. Also, cloud streaming. So again, this is on PC, this is on console, this is on mobile. Also, AI and blockchain is helping this be possible and accessible, and also at a cheaper price point. PlayStation doesn't have any of this. And live service, well, that hasn't been panning out very good. The biggest purchase that Sony had for live service was Bungie. They're like the live service makers, and they're fumbling Destiny 2 right now. And so many people have gotten burned on Destiny 2 that they've either quit, or they're going to quit, or they're going to come back for a little bit for the final shape, but I don't think they're going to buy Marathon. I don't think Marathon's going to do that good. Now, if it's more competitive against Call of Duty, I could see more people playing Marathon. Like more COD players going to Marathon or somewhere else, but I don't feel like it's really going to expand. And so, yeah, live service, it's not a great option right now. Marathon, again, was delayed for 18 months. There's also The Last of Us Online, that was canceled. And then 6 out of the 12 projects, live service projects, were delayed until further notice. Sony, too, they have to stay competitive in gaming. Because, again, this is their biggest revenue stream for Sony. Gaming is a third of their total revenue. Again, we're looking at, $25, $27 billion last year, which is really impressive. And they've been buying studios and IPs behind Microsoft. Microsoft started doing it a few years before, and Sony's like, hey, they're literally buying up like ZeniMax and Bethesda and other stuff. Like, we need to buy some too. And so they bought Insomniac and Bungie, along with quite a few others. To also stay competitive, they need to continue to focus on exclusives and reselling past games and making them remastered. We're seeing that with like Silent Hill 2. We're seeing that with Until Dawn. We got to see that with The Last of Us Part 2 that came out in January. One big ace that I think Sony has up their sleeve is, again, a patent that they have in the Web 3.0 space, where there's a hub between games and also between devices where they can mix and match items between games and between platforms. And I think that's really interesting. Looking at the patent itself is crazy. I'll try to find the patent number again if you wish to look it up yourselves. But yeah, there is a patent up there. It is still being processed. It takes years to process these. But this was filed in March in 2023. So we're at a year now. So we got probably a few more years to go. But I think this is going to be part of the next-gen launch. If it gets approved and all that stuff, PlayStation has to work through that through the patent office. But I think that's going to be big. Again, this is an expansion of service. This is about connecting everything together. This is about, making the games more interchangeable and more connected. And networking is really what sells, folks. And if Sony does it well, I think it could blow up to be pretty big. It would still take the next decade or the next couple of decades like they've been trying with VR. But also it has to be affordable. And that's part of the access problem that some companies are having. Hey, $70 and $100 for a super fancy COVID edition and all of this stuff. And it's like, look, that's too much. And instead we have a game like Miles Morales that sold 10 million copies very quickly for $50. Helldivers 2 has sold millions of copies for a $40, $50 game. And so, purchase price has to be included in that. So ultimately, I believe Sony's timed exclusives also ultimately hurt the company. They did a lot of that stuff where, like, the timed exclusive content, the timed exclusive games, like Deathloop, for example, is that if they can release it all at once, I think that's going to be a bigger bang for their buck. Just like what they did with Helldivers. If they had a timed exclusive stuff for PC, I don't think it would have blown up as much as it is on PC. Because, honestly, PC is better at sharing and making things fun on PC. They're usually more mature players. If that hurts your feelings, you must be young then. Which kind of proves my point. But generally speaking, the more mature players are on PC. because that's where they started. So these people are like 30 to 50 years old, and yeah, they still play video games, and there's a ton of them. There's a lot of younger new people too. But again, if Sony can release more exclusivity and take more of the exclusiveness out of just them and focus more on broadening the audience, that's going to help them make more money. And I'm glad the new CEO of PlayStation is figuring that out. But the exclusivity and the IP and the exclusive IPs, it pushed Microsoft ultimately to innovate in their strategy, which tactically maybe they weren't making more money initially, maybe they weren't making more money in console sales, but their strategy now is no longer console. Excuse me, folks. Their strategy now is no longer console. It's gaming service. And so we've heard from Phil Spencer several times that it's like, look, they're not focusing on console. And I think people totally were missing and were not understanding what he was saying. And I think people eventually will wake up this decade to the whole thing. But I think the biggest proponent is going to be sales numbers between the consoles. And ultimately, most of us, we want the console war to go away. Myself included. I just want us to play games. I just want us to have access. Cross-save, cross-gen, cross-platform. Everybody can hang out with everybody and have a good time. Shouldn't we all want that? So thanks for tuning in, folks. Finally, I've gotten part 1 and part 2 out. Again, I've been working on this for, a couple of months now. But as I started seeing some of this data, it's like, wow, this is actually really interesting. Because, Sony is realizing that they need to change some stuff. And I'm glad they're getting a new CEO. I'm hopeful for Sony. And, my deciding factor of what console I'm going to buy for next gen is going to be where my friends are. So, it's not about exclusives. It's not about the price point necessarily. It's going to be where my friends are. Because ultimately, relationships are more important. So, of course, folks, stay tuned if you liked this state of gaming. And also, if you haven't watched part 1, remember to also do that. I'll have it linked here at the end of the video. But go ahead and like and sub, all that good stuff. That always helps me on YouTube at GamingGarbage22 and also over at Twitch at Don't Tread on Thee. But, liking and subbing is nice, and that definitely helps with the algos. It's a free way to support the channel, and I appreciate all of you that do that. But also share the content. If you know people that would be interested in this, please go ahead and share it with other people. Get it out there, because I think this stuff is important to talk about. Because, again, this is the future of our hobby. Even for some of us, our livelihood. And so, yeah, if you could share it, that'd be great. So hopefully you guys are doing well. Hang in there. Things will eventually look up. Spring is coming. And so better things are around the corner, folks. Just hang on. I know I am. And with that, I'll see you on the next one.